I discovered his infidelity right after giving birth. Hey everyone, my name is Jessica. I'm 32 years old and I'm from Columbus, Ohio. I'm here to share my story, and let me tell you, it's been a wild ride. It all started a few years ago, right after I gave birth to my first child. I never imagined I'd be where I am today, divorced and rebuilding my life from scratch. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs, and my marriage crumbled in a way I never saw coming. So grab a coffee and let me walk you through one of the hardest things I've ever experienced. I never thought I'd be sitting here sharing my story like this, but life has a way of surprising you. My name's Jessica, and a few years ago I thought I had everything figured out. I was married to Jake, my high school sweetheart. We had been together for over a decade, and I was sure he was the love of my life. Fast forward to the day I gave birth to our daughter Emma, and I was on top of the world. Or so I thought. Becoming a mother was a dream come true. I mean, those first few moments after Emma was born were pure magic. After all the hard months of pregnancy and the sheer exhaustion of labor, there she was, a tiny little person who needed me more than anything else in the world. I was overwhelmed with love, pride, and a deep sense of responsibility. For a brief moment, everything seemed perfect. Jake was there too, smiling and holding her, and I thought we were about to embark on this incredible new chapter together as a family. But that happiness didn't last. The days that followed weren't exactly like the picture-perfect moments you see in movies or on social media. Sure, I was filled with love for my baby, but I was also overwhelmed. As any new mom knows, those early weeks are tough. You're running on no sleep, constantly feeding, changing diapers, and trying to figure out this new tiny human who can't tell you what they need. All of that would have been fine if I had the emotional support I expected from Jake. But I didn't. From the moment we brought Emma home, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but Jake wasn't as present as I thought he'd be. Sure, he was physically there, but emotionally it was like he had checked out. He'd come home from work late, claiming he was stuck in meetings or had extra projects to finish. And when he was home, he was glued to his phone or laptop, barely engaging with me or Emma. I told myself that it was just the stress of becoming new parents. Jake had always been hardworking, and I figured he was just trying to juggle his job and the new responsibilities at home. I kept thinking, it's fine. We're adjusting. He'll be more involved once things settle down. But things didn't settle down. In fact, they got worse. One night, after a particularly long day of trying to soothe a fussy Emma, I noticed Jake was unusually quiet. He was sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone, and I asked him if he could help me get Emma to sleep. He nodded but kept staring at his screen. I remember feeling a pang of frustration. I knew something was bothering him, but every time I asked if he was okay, he'd brush it off. "I'm just tired," he'd say. "Work's been crazy." And like always, I let it go. I didn't want to push too hard. I was exhausted too, and honestly, I didn't have the energy to deal with a fight. But that feeling, that gnawing sense that something wasn't right, kept growing. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more and more signs that Jake was distant. He started coming home even later than usual, sometimes not showing up until after Emma and I were already asleep. When I asked where he'd been, he always had a quick excuse. Work dinner, or I had to meet a client. It was believable enough, but the little voice in the back of my head wouldn't shut up. One night, everything changed. Emma had been crying nonstop for hours, and I was completely drained. I'd finally managed to get her to sleep, and I collapsed into bed, desperate for a few hours of rest. As I was drifting off, I heard Jake's phone buzz on the nightstand. I don't know why I did it, but I reached over and picked it up. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was that nagging voice finally pushing me to see the truth. What I saw on the screen sent my heart racing. There, right in front of me, was a message from a woman named Lily. It was simple. "Good night, babe. I miss you." My stomach dropped. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at those words, trying to make sense of them. Who was Lily? And why was she calling my husband babe? I sat there in shock, unable to move. I wanted to wake Jake up, demand answers right then and there. But instead, I put the phone down and lay there, staring at the ceiling. I felt numb, like my whole world had just come crashing down around me. I didn't sleep at all that night. My mind was racing with a million questions, but deep down, I already knew the answer. Jake was cheating on me. The next morning, I couldn't hold it in anymore. After Jake left for work, I grabbed his phone and started scrolling through his messages with Lily. What I found made me sick to my stomach. It wasn't just one or two texts, there were dozens of them. They had been seeing each other for months, even before Emma was born. He had been lying to me for so long, and I had no idea. I felt like a fool. How could I have missed this? How could I have been so blind to what was happening right in front of me? I was devastated. Here I was, a new mom, doing everything I could to take care of our child while Jake was out with someone else. The betrayal cut so deep, I didn't know if I'd ever recover from it. That moment, all I wanted to do was confront him, scream at him for what he'd done, but I didn't. Instead, I decided to wait. I needed time to process everything, to figure out what I was going to do next. 'Cause one thing was for sure, my marriage was never going to be the same again. After discovering those texts from Lily, my world was shaken, but oddly enough, I didn't confront Jake immediately. I wasn't sure if I was in denial or just scared of what I would hear, but for a few days I pretended like everything was normal. I went through the motions of being a new mom, feeding Emma, changing diapers, and doing my best to smile when Jake came home from work late, again. But inside, I was crumbling. The betrayal was like a heavy weight on my chest, and every time I saw Jake, it got worse. I started noticing little things I hadn't paid attention to before. Like how he'd always take his phone with him wherever he went, even to the bathroom. Or how he'd get these random work calls late at night and step outside to take them. There were more missed dinners, unexplained absences, and vague excuses about work. The signs were there all along, but I had been too wrapped up in my new role as a mom to see them. I couldn't stop thinking about Lily. Who was she? How long had this been going on? Was it just physical, or was there more to it? I wanted answers, but I didn't know how to ask. Every time I thought about bringing it up, I imagined Jake gaslighting me, telling me I was crazy or making me feel like I was overreacting. That's what scared me the most, that he would twist everything around and make me doubt myself. I remember one night, a few days after I found the texts, Jake came home smelling like a perfume that definitely wasn't mine. My heart was in my throat the whole evening, but I played it cool. I was sitting on the couch, feeding Emma, and he sat down next to me like everything was fine. He kissed my forehead, asked how my day was, and acted like nothing had changed. But everything had changed, for me at least. I couldn't even look at him without feeling sick. The worst part was, Jake wasn't completely absent. He'd still do things that made me second-guess myself. He'd bring me flowers randomly or offer to take care of Emma so I could get a few hours of sleep. He'd make comments about how proud he was of me as a mom, how lucky he felt to have me. And for a split second, I'd start to believe that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe those texts didn't mean anything. But then reality would hit me again. Those late-night texts from Lily, the perfume, the missed dinners, it wasn't in my head. I wasn't imagining any of it. The man I thought I knew had been lying to me for months, and I didn't know how to fix it. Or if I even wanted to. I became obsessed with the idea of catching him in the act. I needed more proof, something undeniable that would force him to admit the truth. So I started checking his phone whenever I had the chance. It wasn't easy, Jake was careful. But I managed to find more texts and they were getting more explicit. It wasn't just the occasional good night, babe anymore. They were talking about meeting up, about the times they'd spent together while I was pregnant. That was the part that stung the most. While I was carrying his child, he was out with her. I felt humiliated, like I wasn't enough for him anymore. Here I was, dealing with the physical and emotional toll of having a baby while he was out chasing someone else. My confidence was at an all-time low. I was exhausted, hormonal, and now completely heartbroken. But I still didn't confront him. I don't know why. Maybe it was because I was afraid of what would happen if I did. Afraid that he'd deny everything or worse, admit it and tell me he didn't love me anymore. The thought of breaking up our family was unbearable. Emma was so young and I didn't want her to grow up in a broken home. I wanted to believe that we could get through this, that somehow we'd find a way to fix our marriage. But deep down, I knew things were never going to be the same. As the days passed, I felt like I was living a double life. On the outside, I was the perfect wife and mom trying to keep everything together. But inside, I was a mess. I felt like I was losing my mind, constantly overthinking every little thing Jake did. Was he really at work, or was he with her? Every time his phone buzzed, I'd freeze, wondering if it was another text from Lily. Paranoia was eating me alive. I couldn't focus on anything else. Even when I was with Emma, all I could think about was Jake and Lily. I started to hate myself for being so obsessed with it, but I couldn't stop. I needed to know the truth, even though I already knew it. The breaking point came about a week after I first found those texts. Jake had been acting strange all day, distracted, distant, barely making eye contact with me. That night, after Emma went to sleep, he told me he had to go out to run some errands. I asked him what kind of errands he needed to run at 9 p.m., and he just mumbled something about needing to grab some things from the office. He kissed me on the forehead like he always did, but this time I didn't let him leave without a fight. I remember standing in the doorway, my arms crossed, and finally asking him, "Are you seeing someone else?" My voice cracked as I said it, but I had to know. I had to hear him say it. Jake froze, his hand on the doorknob, and for a second I thought he was going to deny it. But then he turned around, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. He didn't have to say a word. I knew. After Jake's silent admission, the atmosphere in our house became suffocating. I had finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at me for weeks, and though Jake hadn't answered verbally, the guilt and shame written all over his face were enough to confirm what I already knew. My husband had been unfaithful, and there was no denying it anymore. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding, and felt a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. I had prepared myself for this moment, but nothing could really prepare me for how it would feel when the truth was out in the open. It was like my world had cracked open, and all the pieces were falling apart right in front of me. "Who is she?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer, but I needed to know. I deserved to know. Jake hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor as if he were searching for the right words. "It's not what you think," he began, but I cut him off. "Don't," I snapped, my voice firmer now. "Don't try to downplay it. Just tell me the truth, Jake." He sighed, rubbing his hands over his face like he was trying to wipe away the guilt. "Her name is Lily," he said quietly, confirming the name I had already seen in those text messages. "We met at a work event a few months ago." "A few months ago?" I repeated, the shock hitting me like a punch to the gut. He had been seeing her for months, during my pregnancy, during the birth of our child, while I was home adjusting to motherhood and struggling with the sleepless nights. The betrayal ran deeper than I had imagined. Why, Jake? Why did you do this? My voice wavered, and I could feel tears stinging the back of my eyes, but I held them back. I wasn't going to break down in front of him. Not yet. Jake looked up at me, his face etched with regret, but it was too late for that. I don't know, he said, his voice hollow. It just happened. Things between us have been different since Emma was born. Different, I repeated, incredulous. Of course, things are different. We have a baby now, Jake. Things are supposed to be different. That's what happens when you become parents. He nodded, but it felt like he was only half listening. I know, Jess. I know. But I felt so disconnected. I didn't know how to handle it, and then I met Lily and she was just there, you know? It wasn't supposed to go this far. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. I couldn't believe he was trying to justify his affair by blaming the changes that came with having a baby. We were supposed to go through those changes together, to grow stronger as a couple and as parents, but instead, he had turned to someone else for comfort. Do you love her? Question slipped out before I could stop it, and I immediately regretted asking. Did it even matter if he loved her? The damage was already done. Jake's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment he didn't answer. Then he shook his head slowly. No, I don't. It's not like that. Then what is it like? I demanded, my voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been cheating on me for months, sneaking around behind my back while I'm at home with our newborn. I made a mistake, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. A huge mistake. And I'm sorry, Jess. I'm so sorry. His apology felt hollow, like he was saying the words because he thought they would make things better, but they didn't. Nothing he could say would take away the betrayal, the lies, the hurt. I stood there, staring at the man I thought I knew, wondering how we had gotten to this point. What do you expect me to do with this, Jake? I asked, my voice shaking. How am I supposed to trust you again? How am I supposed to believe anything you say? I don't know, he admitted, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to fix this. I want to make things right. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Make things right? You can't just fix this like it's some kind of mistake you made at work, Jake. You betrayed me. You betrayed our family. He nodded, his face pale. I know. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to believe that we could somehow work through this, that we could rebuild what we had lost. But another part of me, the part that had been shattered by his infidelity, wasn't sure if it was possible. How could I ever look at him the same way again, knowing what he had done? I need time, I finally said, my voice cracking. I need time to think. Jake nodded slowly, as if he understood. Take all the time you need, he said softly. I'll wait. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked away, my mind spinning with a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion, they all swirled inside me, making it impossible to think clearly. I needed space not just from Jake, but from everything. I needed to figure out what I wanted, what was best for Emma, and whether or not I could ever forgive Jake for what he had done. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on Emma, pouring all my energy into caring for her. But every time I looked at Jake, I felt a surge of anger and pain. The trust we once had was shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. He tried to talk to me, to apologize again and again, but I wasn't ready to listen. I wasn't ready to forgive. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I ever would be. After Jake's confession, I thought I had experienced the worst of it. I was wrong. It's one thing to hear about your partner's infidelity, but it's another to confront the person who's been at the center of your pain. I spent days in a fog, replaying everything Jake said, everything I had discovered. He was sorry, sure, but sorry wasn't going to fix this. Sorry wasn't going to erase the texts, the meetings, or the betrayal. Constant thought of Lily consumed me. I had to know who she was and why she thought it was okay to wreck someone else's family. Was she clueless about me and Emma, or did she just not care? I needed answers, and more than that, I needed closure. That's when I made the decision to confront her. Now, I'll be honest, at first, I had no idea how I was going to find her. But remember those texts I found on Jake's phone? Well, she had sent him a message with her number, and I still had it. I wasn't sure what I'd say when I called her, but I knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. I had too many emotions bottled up inside, and the only way I'd be able to move forward was by getting the full picture. I had to know what kind of person would willingly engage in this affair. The day I called her, I was shaking. My hands trembled as I typed her number into my phone, and my heart was racing faster than ever. Part of me thought she wouldn't answer, but after 2 rings, she picked up. "Hello?" Her voice was calm, soft even. I wasn't expecting that. Didn't match the image of the heartless homewrecker I'd built up in my mind. "Is this Lily?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt inside. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a pause long enough to let me know she had already figured out who I was. "Yes, it is," she said, her tone changing slightly. "Who is this?" "This is Jessica," I said, keeping it simple. "Jake's wife." I heard a sharp intake of breath and then silence. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything, the tension between us almost palpable through the phone. Lily started, but I cut her off. I didn't want excuses or an apology. I wanted the truth. "How long?" I asked, my voice cold, determined. "How long have you been seeing my husband?" There was another pause. "6 months," she finally said, and the words hit me like a punch to the gut. 6 months. Half a year. She had been with Jake before Emma was born, while I was still pregnant, while I was preparing for motherhood. The betrayal ran even deeper than I had thought. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Did you know about me? About our baby?" She hesitated again. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "I knew." Her words were like knives, slicing through whatever thin thread of hope I still had that this had all been some sort of mistake, that maybe she hadn't known about me or Emma. But she did. She knew, and she didn't care. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Why?" I asked. It was the only question I had left. "Why did you do this?" Lily sighed. "I don't know," she said, and for a moment she almost sounded regretful. "Jake made it seem like things between you two were over. He said you were growing apart." I let out a bitter laugh. "Growing apart?" "He was saying that while I was at home carrying our child." "I'm sorry," she said softly, but it didn't feel like enough. Sorry wasn't going to undo the months of deceit, the pain I had felt, the family that was now in ruins because of her and Jake's actions. I don't understand how you could knowingly do this," I said, my voice breaking for the first time. "I don't understand how you could look at a man who's about to become a father and still think it's okay to be with him." Lily didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "I know, and I'm not proud of what I did. I didn't expect it to go this far." "But it did," I said flatly. And now my marriage is over because of it. Another silence fell between us, heavier than before. I didn't want to hear her apologies anymore. They wouldn't fix anything. They wouldn't take away the hurt, the betrayal, or the fact that Jake had chosen her over his family, over me when we needed him the most. I don't know what you and Jake think is going to happen now, I said, my voice hard again. But whatever you two have, you can keep it. Because I'm done. I hung up before she could respond. I didn't need to hear anything else. I had my answers. Lily knew about me, about our family, and she still chose to have an affair with my husband. That was all I needed to know. After the call, I felt empty. Not relieved, not angry, just numb. I had gotten what I wanted, but the truth didn't make me feel better. In fact, it made me feel worse. Jake hadn't just made a mistake. He had deliberately chosen to hurt me and Emma, and there was no going back from that. When Jake came home later that night, I didn't even bother waiting for him to explain himself. I had heard enough from both of them, and I wasn't interested in hearing his side of the story anymore. Trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. I talked to her, I said calmly as he walked through the door. His face paled, and for a moment he looked like he wanted to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. I'm done, Jake, I said, my voice steady. I'm filing for divorce. Filing for divorce was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but once I made the decision, there was a strange sense of relief that followed. It wasn't easy by any means, but finally acknowledging that my marriage was over allowed me to start thinking about what came next. The life I had envisioned with Jake and Emma was gone, but that didn't mean I couldn't build a new life for us, a better one. The day I filed the divorce papers, I felt a mix of emotions. I was sad, of course. I hadn't expected to end up here. But there was also a sense of empowerment. For so long, I had let Jake's actions control me. His lies, his cheating, the endless nights of worry. But not anymore. This was my decision now. I was taking back control of my life. Jake didn't fight the divorce. He didn't beg for me to stay, and in a way that made it easier. It was like he knew he had done too much damage to fix things, and he didn't even try. He agreed to shared custody of Emma, and we worked out the logistics as civilly as possible, but emotionally I was still in pieces. The first few weeks after I left Jake were rough. I had moved in with my mom temporarily while I figured out my next steps. I was grateful for the support, but I also felt like a failure. Here I was, 32 years old, a new mom, and already going through a divorce. This wasn't the life I had pictured for myself, and there were moments where the weight of it all felt unbearable. I cried a lot in those early days. There were times when I questioned everything. Was I doing the right thing by leaving Jake? Would Emma hate me one day for breaking up her family? I couldn't stop replaying the what-ifs in my head. What if I had been more attentive? What if I hadn't been so consumed with motherhood? What if I had tried harder to keep Jake from straying? But with each day that passed, I started to see things more clearly. None of this was my fault. Jake had made his choices, and I couldn't change that. All I could do was focus on what came next, for me and for Emma. And as hard as it was to let go of the idea of the life I had planned, I started to realize that maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was a new beginning. The first real turning point for me was when I found a place of my own. It wasn't much, just a small 2-bedroom apartment, but it was mine. I had a fresh start. I decorated Emma's room with her favorite colors, bought some new furniture, and slowly began to feel like I was rebuilding a home for us. It was empowering to have my own space again, to create something just for me and my daughter. Therapy helped too. I started seeing a therapist a few weeks after filing for divorce, and it was honestly one of the best decisions I made. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me process the whirlwind of emotions I was dealing with. In those sessions, I learned that it was okay to feel sad, angry, and even relieved all at the same time. Healing wasn't linear, and I had to give myself grace to feel all the feelings, no matter how messy they were. One of the biggest hurdles was learning how to trust again, not just other people but myself. After Jake's betrayal, I doubted my own judgment. How had I not seen the signs? How could I have been so blind to what was happening in my own marriage? But therapy helped me realize that it wasn't my fault. I had trusted my husband, and he was the one who had broken that trust, not me. Slowly but surely, I started to regain my confidence. I got back into old hobbies I had abandoned during my marriage, reading, painting, even going to yoga classes. I hadn't realized how much of myself I had lost in my relationship with Jake. I had been so focused on being the perfect wife, the perfect mom, that I had forgotten who I was outside of those roles. Reconnecting with those parts of myself felt liberating, like I was finally coming back to life. The hardest part, of course, was co-parenting with Jake. I won't sugarcoat it, it was awkward and uncomfortable at first. Every time I saw him, I felt a surge of anger and sadness, but I knew that for Emma's sake, I had to keep things civil. I didn't want her to grow up in a hostile environment, and I certainly didn't want her to feel caught in the middle of our mess. Over time, things with Jake became more manageable. We worked out a routine for sharing custody of Emma, and while we weren't exactly friends, we learned how to coexist for her sake. There were still moments of tension, moments when I wanted to scream at him for what he had done to us, but I tried my best to let those feelings go. Holding on to that anger wasn't going to help anyone, least of all me. As the months passed, I started to feel stronger. I was still grieving the loss of my marriage, but I was also finding joy in new things. I loved watching Emma grow and develop her little personality. She was my anchor through it all, the reason I kept pushing forward even when it felt impossible. Every time she smiled at me or reached out for a hug, it reminded me that I was doing the right thing. I was creating a better life for her, even if it didn't look like the life I had originally imagined. After months of emotional turbulence, I've come to realize that the most difficult parts of life also offer the biggest opportunities for growth. What started as the most painful chapter of my life, the discovery of Jake's infidelity and the breakdown of my marriage, ended up teaching me lessons I never expected to learn. And while I'm still healing, I've finally found a sense of peace that I never thought I'd experience again. One of the first and most important lessons I learned was about self-worth. For the longest time, I blamed myself for Jake's affair. I wondered if I hadn't been a good enough wife, if I had somehow driven him away by not being the perfect partner. But through therapy and self-reflection, I realized that none of this was my fault. Jake's betrayal wasn't about me. It was about his own insecurities, his own failures. I had done my best, and that was enough. Realizing this was like lifting a huge weight off my shoulders. I was enough. I am enough. Another big lesson was learning to let go. Letting go of the anger, the hurt, and the dreams I had for our family was hard, probably one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. But holding on to all that pain wasn't serving me anymore. It was like carrying a backpack full of rocks weighing me down. And once I allowed myself to put that backpack down, I started to feel lighter. I allowed myself to grieve the loss of my marriage, but then I made a conscious decision to move forward. Moving forward meant focusing on the things that really mattered, like Emma. Being her mom has been the most grounding and fulfilling experience in my life. She has no idea how much she's saved me through all of this. Every day, she's a reminder of what's truly important. She doesn't care that her dad and I aren't together anymore. She just wants to be loved and cared for. That's what I've chosen to focus on, being the best mom I can be, even though things look different than I originally imagined. I've also learned the importance of setting boundaries, especially with Jake. Co-parenting has its challenges, and while we've managed to keep things civil, I've had to establish clear lines to protect myself emotionally. Early on, I found myself slipping into old habits, letting him walk all over me just to avoid conflict. But I realized that wasn't healthy. I deserve respect, and I deserve to feel safe in my own life. Setting those boundaries wasn't just necessary, it was empowering. I'm in control of my own happiness now, and I'm no longer bending over backward to make someone else comfortable at my own expense. Another huge part of this journey was rediscovering my independence. When you're in a long-term relationship, especially one that spans a decade or more, it's easy to lose parts of yourself. I had spent so much time being Jake's wife that I forgot who Jessica was outside of that role. Took time, but slowly I started to reconnect with the things I loved, the things that made me feel like me. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done in years. I started going for walks in the park with Emma, finding peace in nature. I even tried out some new hobbies like baking and meditation. It was all part of this larger journey of self-discovery, and it felt amazing to be my own person again. One of the most surprising lessons was about forgiveness. Now, let me be clear, I didn't forgive Jake for what he did right away, and even now I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive him in the traditional sense. But I've come to a place of acceptance. I've accepted that he made his choices, and those choices hurt me deeply, but I'm not going to let that hurt define my life anymore. Holding on to the resentment was only keeping me stuck in the past. Letting go doesn't mean I've excused his behavior, but it means I'm no longer letting it control my future. Forgiving him in a way was more about freeing myself than it was about absolving him. With time, I've also learned to trust again, not just in other people but in myself. I trust my judgment now. I trust my instincts. For a long time, I doubted everything after discovering Jake's affair. I doubted my ability to see the truth, to make good decisions. But now I realize that I wasn't blind, I was trusting. And trust is a beautiful thing, even if it was misplaced in that particular relationship. I haven't closed myself off to love or to people in general. I'm just more aware of what I need and deserve in the future. Speaking of the future, I've learned not to rush things. Healing is not linear, and I'm okay with that. There are still days when I feel sad, when the weight of it all hits me out of nowhere. But I've stopped putting pressure on myself to get over it by a certain time. This journey is mine, and I'm taking it one step at a time. There's no rush to find another relationship, no rush to move on in the way society expects me to. Right now, I'm focused on my growth, my happiness, and creating a stable, loving environment for Emma. Lastly, and maybe most importantly, I've learned that life after betrayal isn't the end. It's not the end of love, of joy, or of family. In fact, it can be the beginning of something entirely new. Something stronger, more fulfilling. I never imagined I'd be here, standing on the other side of such a devastating experience, but here I am, stronger, wiser, and more at peace than I ever thought possible. What we can learn from betrayal and healing according to the Bible. In moments of deep sorrow, when trust is broken and we feel betrayed, it is easy to wonder where God is in our pain. But the Bible offers wisdom and comfort in times of trial, especially when we face situations like betrayal in marriage. By turning to Scripture, we can find strength, guidance, and healing even in the darkest moments. The story of betrayal, like the one shared here, mirrors the experiences of many in the Bible. Let us reflect on these lessons and discover what God's Word teaches us about dealing with betrayal, forgiveness, and healing. The reality of human weakness. Throughout the Bible, we are reminded of the weakness of human nature. We are all capable of making mistakes and straying from the path God has set for us. As it is written in Romans 3 verse 23, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Betrayal is a painful reminder of the brokenness that exists in the world, a consequence of living in a fallen state. It can come in the form of lies, deceit, or infidelity. But this brokenness is not the end of the story. It's an opportunity to rely on God's grace. When Jesus was betrayed by Judas, he understood the depth of human failure. He had known Judas, shared meals with him, and loved him as one of his own disciples. And yet, Judas chose to betray him for silver. Jesus' response is one of heartbreak, but also of grace. He did not retaliate. Instead, he demonstrated that even in the face of betrayal, God's plan will prevail. In marriage, when trust is shattered by infidelity or deceit, the pain is intense. But the Bible reminds us that even in our hurt, we must turn to God. Psalm 34 verse 18 tells us, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." When our hearts are broken, God is near, offering His comfort and love. Forgiveness, a command and a path to healing. One of the most challenging teachings of the Bible is the call to forgive. Jesus tells us in Matthew 6 verses 14 to 15, "For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins." Forgiveness is not optional for those who follow Christ, it is a command. But what does forgiveness look like in the context of betrayal, especially in something as intimate as marriage? Forgiveness does not mean excusing or justifying the wrong that was done. Instead, it means releasing the bitterness and anger that can consume us if left unchecked. Holding on to resentment can poison our hearts, keeping us stuck in a place of hurt. The Bible teaches us that forgiveness is about freeing ourselves from that burden and trusting God to deal with justice in His own time. Jesus modeled this perfectly on the cross. Despite the betrayal He faced, He still prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23 verse 34. He was able to see beyond his immediate pain and choose love over hatred. Similarly, when we are faced with betrayal, the Bible invites us to trust God's justice while extending forgiveness. Forgiving doesn't mean we must forget or remain in a harmful situation. In cases of infidelity or other serious betrayals, the Bible also acknowledges the right to separate when necessary. Matthew 19 verse 9 says, "I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery." This acknowledges that some wounds are deep enough to justify separation. But even then, forgiveness is still essential, not for the sake of the betrayer, but for the peace it brings to the one who forgives. Trusting in God's plan. When betrayal hits, it can feel as though our entire world is crumbling. But in these moments, the Bible reminds us that God's plans for us are still good. One of the most comforting verses for those in pain is Jeremiah 29 verse 11, where God says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." God is always working, even when we cannot see it. Romans 8 verse 28 reassures us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." While the betrayal we face may not make sense in the moment, and while it may cause deep pain, God is able to use even our hardships for our growth and for His glory. The story of Joseph in the Old Testament is an excellent example of this. His brothers betrayed him, selling him into slavery, but God used that betrayal to position Joseph in a place of power in Egypt, where he would later save his family and many others from famine. Joseph's response to his brothers in Genesis 50 verse 20 is one we can all learn from. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Similarly, in the midst of betrayal, we may not understand why things are happening, but we can trust that God is weaving together a greater plan for our lives. He can take our broken pieces and create something beautiful from them, renewing our strength in the Lord. Lastly, the Bible teaches us that in times of deep pain we can find our strength in the Lord. Isaiah 40 verse 31 encourages us with these words, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." It's normal to feel weak and exhausted after a betrayal, but God promises to renew our strength if we place our hope in Him. We don't have to face betrayal alone. In Philippians 4 verse 13, Paul writes, "I can do all this through Him who gives me strength." God is our refuge and strength, and He will sustain us when we feel like we cannot move forward. Conclusion: moving forward with God's grace. Betrayal is painful, but the Bible offers us hope, healing, and the tools to move forward. Through the stories of others who have experienced betrayal, whether it be Joseph, David, or Jesus himself, we see that God can turn our pain into purpose. He calls us to forgive, to trust in His plan, and to renew our strength in Him. In the end, healing from betrayal is a process, but with God by our side, we can find peace. As we let go of anger and bitterness, forgive those who have wronged us, and place our trust in the Lord's plan, we will discover that God's love is greater than any pain we've experienced. His grace will carry us through, and in Him we will find the strength to rebuild our lives stronger than before.